Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
I want you to just stop whatever you're doing for just a second and consider one of the most profound questions in human history.
Oh, setting the bar high right out of the gate.
Hey, it's a question that sounds deceptively simple, right?
Yeah.
But it has the power to basically upend how you understand the mechanics of your own mind.
Yeah, it really does.
The question is this: do the words you possess determine the thoughts you are capable of thinking?
Which is, it represents the ultimate chicken or egg scenario in cognitive science. We're dealing with the fundamental architecture of human consciousness here.
Right.
Because if we assume that language is merely a communication tool, like just a way to output fully formed thoughts, then words are just labels.
Just tags we put on things.
Exactly. But if language is the operating system itself, well, then the code you run dictates the programs you can execute.
And that right there is the core mission of our deep dive today. We are exploring this vast, heavily contested landscape of cognitive science research, linguistic studies, and cross-cultural experiments to try and answer that exact question.
Yeah, it's a wild ride.
We're going to figure out if learning a new language just gives you a new set of vocal noises through the same old concepts, or if it literally, rewires your brain.
Yeah, handing you a brand new cognitive toolkit.
Exactly. A toolkit that alters how you experience time, how you navigate physical space, how you process colors, and even how you arrive at moral judgments.
And establishing the stakes here is crucial, I think. This is far from just, academic navel-gazing.
Oh, absolutely not.
If language influences thought, then the specific grammar and vocabulary of your native tongue actively shape a reality that other people might not even share.
Which is kind of terrifying, but also amazing.
Right. So we are going to navigate the extremes of this debate today, starting from the heavily romanticized myth that language acts as an inescapable prison for your mind.
Right.
And journeying all the way into the rigorous empirical evidence that shows how language subtly yet continuously mediates your everyday sensory perceptions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the modern scientific consensus, we kind of have to look at the genesis of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis back in the 1930s.
Yeah, the origin story is fascinating.
It really is. What's so crazy about Benjamin Lee Whorf is that he wasn't even a professional linguist by trade, at least not initially.
Right, he was an engineer.
Yeah, a chemical engineer, working as a fire prevention inspector for an insurance company of all things.
And his background in fire inspection is actually what seeded his entire linguistic theory.
Yeah, explain that, because it's such a cool connection.
So Whorf noticed that people behaved completely differently around gasoline drums based on the specific words used to describe them.
Yep.
Workers would be incredibly cautious around drums that were labeled full, keeping their distance, being careful.
Sure, because full means danger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they would casually smoke cigarettes and toss matches near drums labeled empty. Right, because the word empty implied a void, a lack of danger. Even though those so-called empty drums were actually full of highly volatile, flammable gasoline vapor.
Oh, what?
Yeah, they were actually far more explosive than the full ones.
So he saw firsthand that the linguistic label literally overrode the physical reality in these workers' minds.
Exactly. The word empty determined their behavior, even when it directly contradicted basic safety protocols.
That is wild. And that observation led him to team up with Edward Sapir to formulate their famous hypothesis, right?
Yes, which comes in two distinct forms. It's really important to separate them. There's the strong form, known as linguistic determinism, and the weak form, which is linguistic relativity.
Okay, let's break those down.
So the strong form makes this absolute claim that the categories available in your language rigidly fix the boundaries of your thoughts, like a hard limit.
So if your language lacks a word for a concept, you are basically cognitively blind to it.
Under that strict deterministic framework, yes. Speakers of different languages would basically inhabit entirely incommensurable cognitive universes.
We literally couldn't understand each other.
Right. And it's an alluring idea because it makes language seem almost magical, but it is demonstrably false.
Right. The cognitive sciences have pretty much dismantled linguistic determinism quite thoroughly.
Oh, completely. We know that universal conceptual categories exist across human populations, regardless of syntax.
And just logically, the very act of learning a second language or translating novel concepts, which humans do effortlessly every single day, that would be fundamentally impossible if our minds were entirely walled in by our first language's dictionary.
Exactly. I mean, we invent new words precisely because we have a thought that lacks a label. The thought comes first. It precedes the word.
But this strong determinism theory, it is just so sticky in pop culture, like it won't die.
Yeah.
Whenever I discuss this topic, someone invariably brings up the Inuit words for snow.
Oh, of course. It's always the snow.
Right. But wait, don't the Inuit have dozens of words for snow? And doesn't that mean they see snow differently? Like, that's the popular claim, right?
That is the popular claim, and the words for snow trope is perhaps the most persistent myth in popular linguistics.
So what's actually going on there?
Well, it stems from a profound misunderstanding of morphological typology. When we talk about Inuit languages, we are dealing with polysynthetic agglutinative languages.
Okay, let's translate that for us non-linguists.
Sure. So in an isolating language like English, we string discrete, separate words together to form a sentence. We use spaces. So we say, the softly falling snow that is good for packing into a sled runner.
Right. Bunch of separate words doing different jobs.
Exactly. In an agglutinative language, they take a root word for snow and just attach a series of morphemes, basically grammatical glue, to express all those adjectives and verbs within a single continuous utterance.
So they just mash it all together into one giant word form.
Yes. So to a naive outside observer looking at a transcript, it looks like this massive magical dictionary with the distinct entry for every possible microscopic state of snow.
But cognitively, they aren't doing anything different than us.
Precisely. Cognitively, they're doing the exact same compositional work that an English speaker does when assembling a sentence. There's a mechanical difference in syntax, not some metaphysical difference in visual perception.
That makes so much sense. We can also look at Worf's own most famous and ultimately completely flawed ethnographic claim regarding the Hopi people in North America.
Oh, yes, the Hopi time controversy.
Right. He asserted that the Hopi language contained literally no words, no grammatical forms or expressions that referred directly to what we call time.
Which is quite the claim to make.
Yeah, he claimed they had no concept of the past, present, or future as a linear progression. None at all.
Which turned out to be a catastrophic error of translation and ethnographic interpretation on Worf's part.
How did he get it so wrong?
Well, he relied heavily on a single informant living in New York City rather than actually conducting extensive field work on the reservation.
Oh, wow. So just one guy in New York.
Yeah. And decades later, linguists like Eckhart Malotki spent years intimately studying the Hopi language in the field, and he published these massive, dense volumes entirely dedicated to Hopi time expressions.
So they definitely have time.
They absolutely do. The Hopi have highly sophisticated mechanisms for tense. They track astronomical cycles meticulously, and they absolutely conceptualize time.
So what was Worf looking at then?
Worf essentially conflated a lack of European-style grammatical tense markers with a lack of conceptual time, which is a massive, unjustifiable analytical leap.
Right. So linguistic determinism, this idea that language is a cognitive straitjacket, is dead in the water.
Completely.
So we pivot to the weak form, linguistic relativity. The consensus shifts from language dictating thought to language influencing or biasing thought.
Yes, the nudge rather than the prism.
Exactly. And to understand the mechanics of that subtle influence, we have to examine the most rigorously quantified domain of human perception. We have to look at how the optic nerve and the brain process color.
Yes, color is the perfect battleground for this debate.
Right, because we understand the underlying biology so incredibly well.
Exactly. For a large part of the 20th century, cultural anthropologists assumed color categories were entirely arbitrary.
Like, just totally random.
Yeah, they believed a culture could just look at the visible light spectrum, the rainbow, and slice it up however they culturally please.
But that's not true, is it?
Not at all. In 1969, researchers Brent Berlin and Paul Kay conducted this foundational study mapping color terms across global languages, and they discovered a rigid, universal biological baseline.
So it's not random, there's a structure.
There is a highly predictable evolutionary hierarchy. If a language only has two basic color terms, which some do, those terms will always, without exception, divide the spectrum into dark and cool versus light and warm, basically black and white.
Okay, so that's stage one.
Right. And if a language evolves a third term, the visual system dictates that the third term is always red.
Always red. Why red specifically?
The prioritization of red is rooted directly in primate evolutionary biology. Our visual system, specifically the cones in our retinas, evolved trichromatic vision largely to detect the contrast of ripe red fruits against a background of green foliage.
Also finding food.
Finding food, and also to perceive changes in blood oxygenation in the skin of other primates.
Wait, really? Like blushing?
Yes, blushing, flushing with anger, or signaling sexual arousal. The biological hardware flags the color red as highly salient for survival and social interaction, so human languages universally encode it incredibly early in their development.
Wow. And the hierarchy continues from there, right? The fourth and fifth terms are always yellow and green.
Yeah.
Then comes blue, then brown, and finally those nuanced shades like purple, pink, orange, and gray.
Exactly. So we all share the exact same optical hardware.
But the software, our native language, can subtly tweak the performance of that hardware. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does.
Let's talk about the Russian blue experiment conducted by researchers like Lyra Boroditsky and Jonathan Winower. Because in English, we just have the overarching basic category of blue.
Right. It's one big bucket.
We can add modifiers, sure, like light or dark, but conceptually it's just blue. Russian, however, forces a mandatory linguistic boundary.
They do. They have two entirely separate basic categories. There's Goluboy for light blue and Sini for dark blue.
They aren't just shades to them, they're fundamentally different colors, like pink and red are to us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to understand the impact of that boundary, we have to look at a neurological phenomenon called categorical perception.
Okay, what is that?
Categorical perception is the brain's tendency to exaggerate differences across a category boundary and minimize differences within a category.
So it highlights the borders.
Yes. We actually see this in phonetics all the time. Your brain easily distinguishes between a B sound and a P sound, right?
Sure, bat and pat.
Right, because they cross a linguistic boundary in English, they mean different things. But physically, acoustically, the difference in voice onset time is tiny. Your brain exaggerates that acoustic difference because it's linguistically useful.
Got it. So Boroditsky and Winower set out to see if categorical perception applies to visual processing based on language.
Yes. They placed Russian speakers and English speakers in front of a screen and showed them 3 blue squares, a target square on top and 2 options below.
And the subject just had to press a button indicating which of the bottom squares matched the top one. Sounds pretty simple.
Very simple. But the crucial variable was the specific shade of those blue squares.
Right.
Sometimes the 2 bottom squares were both within the Russian Cine category, so just 2 slightly different shades of dark blue.
Okay.
Other times, the 2 squares crossed the linguistic boundary, meaning one was a dark Cine and the other was a light Goluboy.
Even though the physical difference on the light spectrum was exactly the same in both scenarios.
Identical. The mathematical distance in wavelength was kept completely constant.
And the results are wild. The Russian speakers were measurably faster and more accurate at distinguishing the colors when they crossed that Goluboy and Cine boundary.
Right. They had a measurable speed advantage.
But the English speakers, looking at the exact same wavelengths of light, showed absolutely no speed advantage regardless of where the colors fell.
Because to their English-speaking brains, it was all just blue.
I always visualize this as a mental filing cabinet.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like the Russian language provides a pre-sorted cabinet with 2 distinct drawers. So when their visual cortex encounters the colors, the linguistic tagging system just instantly routes them into separate drawers, speeding up the whole cognitive retrieval process.
Right.
But the English brain, we just had to dump them all in the same drawer and then spend extra milliseconds physically comparing them.
That mental filing cabinet analogy perfectly describes the behavioral outcome. But the researchers needed to prove the underlying mechanism, right?
Because it could just be a habit, maybe.
Exactly. They needed to demonstrate that this wasn't just some lingering habit formed in childhood, but that the language areas of the brain were actively, continuously mediating visual processing in real time.
So how do you prove that?
To prove it, they introduced a dual task paradigm, specifically a verbal interference task.
Ah, okay. What's fascinating here is how they essentially hacked the brain to prove this.
Yes. They made the subjects perform the exact same color matching test on the screen, But while doing it, they forced them to memorize and silently repeat an 8-digit string of numbers in their head.
Oh, wow. So they tied up the language center.
Exactly. By forcing the subjects to rehearse those numbers, they heavily loaded the working memory of the left hemisphere, which houses the primary language centers, Broca's and Wernicke's areas.
The language machinery was completely occupied.
Completely offline for the visual task.
And the moment you tie up that linguistic processor, the Russian speed advantage just completely evaporates.
It vanishes.
They become just as slow as the English speakers at distinguishing the shades. It literally proves that the language center isn't just a passive dictionary in the background. It's an active coprocessor, constantly feeding categorical data to the visual cortex.
It demonstrates that our perception of the physical world is really a composite sketch.
A composite sketch, I like that.
Right. The visual hardware provides the raw sensory input, but the linguistic software provides the contrast and the outlines. And when you disable the software, the perception simply becomes less sharp.
Okay, so if language can reach into the visual cortex and alter how we slice up the light spectrum, we have to look at what happens when grammar assigns completely arbitrary identities to inanimate objects.
Yes, moving from sensory perception into abstract conceptualization.
Right. Let's examine grammatical gender.
Grammatical gender is a feature that often completely baffles English speakers.
Mostly because we don't have to deal with it.
Right. English lost most of its grammatical gender during the Middle English period. But in languages like Russian, Spanish, German, or French, the entire noun lexicon is divided into gendered classes.
Every single noun.
Every single one. The assignment of these classes is historically complex, stemming from Proto-Indo-European noun classification systems. Originally, those systems differentiated between animate and inanimate objects, but they eventually morphed into masculine, feminine, and neuter categories.
And importantly for our discussion today, the assignment of gender to inanimate objects right now is almost entirely arbitrary.
Completely arbitrary.
Like a key is not inherently masculine. A bridge is not inherently feminine.
Right. There is nothing about a bridge that possesses biological sex.
But because these grammatical tags are mandatory in those languages, they create this massive natural experiment. Like if a language constantly forces you to categorize a table as feminine and a chair as masculine, does that structural requirement leak into your semantic understanding of the object itself?
And Lera Boroditsky tested this brilliantly using the now famous bridge experiment.
Yes, the bridge experiment. Walk us through that.
So Boroditsky focused on native German and native Spanish speakers who were also bilingual in English. She isolated a set of objects where the grammatical gender was perfectly inverted between the two languages.
So masculine in one, feminine in the other.
Exactly. The classic example is the word for bridge. In German, die Brücke is grammatically feminine. In Spanish, el puente is grammatically masculine.
Okay, so total flip.
Right. The experimenters simply showed the subjects a picture of a bridge and asked them to generate 3 adjectives in English to describe it.
And the results map perfectly onto the grammatical tags of their native languages.
They really do. German speakers overwhelmingly generated stereotypically feminine adjectives.
Even though they were speaking in English at the time.
Yes. They described bridges as beautiful, elegant, fragile, peaceful, slender.
And the Spanish speakers.
Looking at the exact same picture, the Spanish speakers utilized stereotypically masculine adjectives. They called the bridge strong, sturdy, towering, dangerous, heavy.
That's so strange. And we see the same pattern replicated across dozens of objects, right?
Oh, absolutely. Take an apple. It's masculine in German, but feminine in Spanish. A key is masculine in German, feminine in Spanish. The descriptive vocabulary consistently tracks with the arbitrary grammatical assignment.
Okay, but the crucial mechanism to clarify here is that the speakers are not consciously anthropomorphizing these objects, right?
No, not at all.
Like a Spanish speaker doesn't look at a suspension bridge and consciously think, what a burly masculine structure.
Right. They aren't picturing a man holding up the bridge. The influence operates entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness through semantic associative networks.
Semantic associative networks. Break that down for us.
So, in the brain, concepts are not stored in isolated silos. They are stored in sprawling, interconnected webs of meaning. When a German speaker retrieves the concept of a bridge to speak about it, their brain must simultaneously activate the grammatical machinery for the feminine gender to construct a grammatically correct sentence.
Because it's mandatory. You can't say it without the gender.
Exactly. And the act of repeatedly firing that feminine grammatical node over years and years causes activation to literally bleed over into adjacent nodes in the semantic network.
So it bleeds into the concepts of femininity.
Precisely the mechanism. The repeated mandatory coactivation of bridge and feminine grammar strengthens the neural pathways to abstract concepts associated with femininity in that specific culture.
It's basically a subtle priming effect.
Very subtle. The grammatical tag acts as a kind of gravitational pull, slightly warping the conceptual space around the object. It highlights certain features of the bridge, like its elegance, while downplaying others, like its sheer mass.
That is the absolute essence of weak linguistic relativity. A structural requirement of the language is gently nudging the conceptual representation in a non-deliberate way.
Perfectly stated.
So grammar categorizes the objects right in front of us. But let's scale this up to the invisible dimensions we move through constantly. Let's talk about physical space and chronological time.
Oh, this is where it gets incredibly mind-bending.
We're moving from associative networks to actual real-time spatial navigation. And to do this, we need to look at the Cook Thayor.
Yes, the Cook Thayor are an Aboriginal Australian community located in Pormpuraaw, which is on the western edge of the Cape York Peninsula.
The linguistic encoding of spatial relationships in this community provides some of the most striking behavioral evidence for relativity that I've ever seen.
It really does. To set the stage, human beings generally use two distinct frames of reference to navigate the world.
Right.
The first is an egocentric, or relative, frame of reference. This is what English heavily relies on. We calculate coordinates relative to the axes of our own bodies, left, right, front, back.
And the defining feature of an egocentric frame is that the coordinates are unstable.
Exactly. They change when you change.
Right. Like if a coffee cup is on my right and I rotate my body 180 degrees, the cup is now on my left.
Yeah.
The object in the physical world remained completely stationary, but my linguistic description of its location completely inverted just because my body moved.
Which is actually a very self-centered way to map reality, if you think about it.
Very egocentric, literally.
Right. Now, the second system is an allocentric, or absolute, frame of reference. This utilizes fixed coordinates independent of the observer's body, usually cardinal directions like north, south, east, and west.
Now, obviously, English speakers use absolute directions for large-scale geographic navigation. We say, drive north on the highway. But we almost never use them for micro-scale interactions.
No, you'd never say pass the salt to the southeast.
Right. But the Cook Thayor language, which was studied extensively by cognitive scientists like Stephen Levinson and Lera Boroditsky, relies almost exclusively on an absolute frame of reference for everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
From a massive landscape down to a table.
They don't even have words for left or right in the spatial sense. They would literally say, there is an ant on your southwest leg, or move your cup a little to the north-northwest.
And the cognitive implications of this grammatical constraint are staggering. In order to speak Cook Thayor fluently, and honestly just to interact in socially appropriate ways, your brain must be continuously computing your exact orientation relative to the Earth's poles.
So to speak Cook Thayor, you basically have to be a walking GPS.
You literally do. You are required to maintain a process known in navigation as dead reckoning. Constantly.
And from a neurobiological standpoint, this relies heavily on the hippocampus, right?
Yes, the hippocampus contains specialized neurons called place cells and head direction cells. Every human brain has this exact same hardware.
But because English grammar allows us to rely on our own bodies as the anchor point, we essentially let our allocentric computing power just sit in idle mode.
We let it atrophy, in a way. The Cook Thayor grammar forces that hippocampal hardware to run at maximum capacity constantly. They are perpetually oriented.
The researchers literally tested this by spinning people in dark rooms, didn't they?
They did. You can spin a Cook Thayor speaker in a dark room, disorient them, and they can still point precisely to the cardinal directions. It's a task where English speakers perform at mere chance levels. We just guess.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it illustrates a fundamental principle, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Language acts as a mechanism for directing attention.
Yes. Because their language demands cardinal information just to form a basic sentence, their brains are trained from infancy to relentlessly attend to environmental cues.
Like the position of the sun.
The sun, the prevailing winds, the shadow angles, the flora, they use all of it to continuously update their internal cognitive map.
The spatial mapping is incredible, but the deeper revelation for me comes when we look at how this spatial architecture fundamentally dictates their processing of time.
Oh, this is the best part.
Right. Because the brain doesn't have a dedicated sensory organ for time. We don't have a time gland.
No, we don't.
So to comprehend time, the human brain essentially hijacks the neural circuitry used for spatial processing. We spatialize time to understand it.
And Boroditsky designed a brilliant temporal sequence task to test this mapping across cultures. Subjects were given a shuffled stack of cards depicting a chronological progression. So like a man aging, a banana being eaten, a crocodile growing larger.
And they were simply asked to arrange the cards in the correct temporal order on a table.
Exactly. Just put them in chronological order.
Now, when you ask an English speaker to do this, the results are entirely predictable. We arrange the cards from left to right.
Every single time.
Because it's an artifact of our writing system. We scan text from left to right, so we build a mental timeline that flows in that exact same direction.
Right. Our temporal map is locked to our egocentric spatial frame, left to right.
But the Kukik Thayor, utilizing their allocentric spatial frame, arrange time entirely differently. They arrange the cards from east to west,
mirroring the trajectory of the sun across the sky.
This means their mental timeline is not locked to their bodies at all. It is completely locked to the landscape.
Which is fascinating when you watch them do the task. If a Kuk Thayor speaker is seated facing south, they will arrange the temporal cards from left to right.
Because east is to their left.
Right. But if you ask them to switch seats and face north, they will arrange the exact same cards from right to left, because east is now to their right.
And if they face east, time basically comes toward them.
Exactly. This experiment proves a causal relationship between linguistic structure and cognitive architecture. The directionality of time isn't just an arbitrary choice for them, it is fundamentally downstream of their spatial grammar.
Their language forces an absolute spatial frame, and the brain uses that exact same absolute frame to scaffold the abstract concept of chronological time.
It is a stunning example of linguistic relativity.
Okay, so if the structure of a language dictates how we map time and physical space, we have to look at what happens when grammar forces a hard conceptual separation between the present moment and the future.
Right, moving from spatial time to grammatical time.
Yes, and this brings us to the highly controversial intersection of linguistics and behavioral economics. We have to talk about the Keith Chen thesis.
Oh, Keith Chen. In 2013, he was an economist at Yale, and he published a paper that sent absolute shockwaves through both economics and linguistics.
What was the hypothesis?
He hypothesized that the specific grammatical rules governing future tense could directly influence macroeconomic behavior, specifically things like savings rates and physical health outcomes.
Okay, walk us through the logic there.
Chen utilized a linguistic framework that divides languages based on their future time reference, or FTR.
FTR, okay.
Languages like English or Greek are classified as having strong future time reference. They grammatically force you to distinguish the future from the present.
Right. If I am talking about the weather, I say it is raining today, but I am grammatically compelled to add a marker for tomorrow. It will rain tomorrow.
Exactly. You must erect a grammatical wall between now and later. Conversely, languages like German or Mandarin Chinese are classified as having weak future time reference.
People sometimes call them futureless languages, right?
Colloquially, yes.
Yeah.
They do not require a mandatory grammatical marker to indicate future events. So in German, you can say morgen regnet es, which translates directly to tomorrow it rains.
The present tense verb functions perfectly well for future events.
Provided the context is clear, yes. So Chen's theoretical leap was based on the economic concept of time discounting.
Time discounting. That's the tendency for people to value an immediate reward more highly than a future reward, right? Like, give me a marshmallow now instead of 2 tomorrow.
Precisely. Chen argued that if your language forces you to build a mandatory grammatical wall between the present and the future, constantly tagging the future as a separate, distinct state, the future inherently feels psychologically more distant.
And the behavioral consequence of that psychological distance is a steeper discount rate.
Right. If the future feels disconnected from your present self, you are simply less likely to defer gratification.
Why save $1 today for a distant, separate future? Why exercise or quit smoking if the health benefits accrue to a future self that your grammar treats as a distinctly different entity.
That was the theory. And Chen analyzed vast data sets from the OECD, comparing countries with strong future tense languages to those with weak ones. And the correlations he presented were staggering.
What did he find?
He claimed that speakers of weak future tense languages, the ones that don't grammatically separate present and future, were 39% more likely to save money.
Why?
They retired with 25% more wealth, were 24% less likely to smoke, and 13% less likely to be obese.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Because, come on, isn't this just a massive coincidence? How can you separate grammar from centuries of history, culture, and economic policy?
This raises an important question, and it was the exact question the entire linguistic community screamed at him.
Right. Like, a German speaker might save more than a Greek speaker, not because of verb conjugations, but because of differing economic institutions or Protestant historical influences.
Absolutely. And Chen was well aware of that obvious pushback. To account for it, he attempted to aggressively control for confounding variables. He compared distinct language groups living within the same country.
Oh, okay.
For example, comparing French, German, and Italian speakers all living under the exact same legal and economic systems in Switzerland.
That's a clever way to isolate it.
It was. He also compared different ethnic populations within sub-Saharan Africa, and he claimed the correlation held strong even when isolated from national borders and institutional differences.
It's an incredibly seductive narrative. The idea that you could tweak a country's GDP or healthcare costs by altering verb conjugations is literally a policymaker's dream.
It is. But we need to seriously examine the methodology here because the pushback from the linguistic community was fierce and, frankly, largely justified.
What was the main issue?
The core issue is that Chen treated language categories as binary, independent data points, which violates fundamental principles of historical linguistics. The critique centers on what anthropologists call Galton's problem. You cannot treat languages as independent data points because they are historically linked by common ancestry.
Right. If two neighboring countries both lack a strong future tense and both happen to have high savings rates, they might just share a common cultural ancestor that valued thrift and happen to speak a certain way.
Exactly. You aren't measuring two independent trials in a lab. You are measuring one historical event twice.
Furthermore, linguists like Oestendahl pointed out that Chen's classification of strong versus weak FTR was highly reductive, wasn't it?
Very reductive. English has a strong future marker with will, but historically, will derives from a verb meaning to want or to desire.
Right.
German uses werden for the future, which derives from to become. The boundaries between present and future are incredibly messy, highly contextual, and constantly evolving in every language.
And beyond the statistical issues, the psychological mechanism itself remains unverified in controlled laboratory settings, doesn't it?
That is the sticking point. Chen established a massive macroeconomic correlation, but experimental psychologists have struggled to prove that speaking English actually induces a measurable feeling of psychological distance compared to speaking German in a controlled environment.
So Chen's work kind of stands as a high watermark for the sheer ambition of linguistic relativity research, but it also serves as a massive cautionary tale.
It really highlights the immense difficulty of isolating the subtle cognitive nudges of grammar from the massive gravity well effects of culture, history, and institutional economics.
Still, while the macroeconomic effects of grammar remain hotly contested, the microcognitive effects of vocabulary, specifically how we construct abstract thought using metaphor, that is supported by an overwhelming consensus.
Yes. To understand how deeply language scaffolds our intellect, we have to look at the work of cognitive linguists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson.
Yes, and their seminal 1980 framework, Metaphors We Live By, which is a great book, by the way.
A classic. Lakoff and Johnson completely revolutionized how we view metaphor. Traditionally, metaphor was seen merely as a poetic device, just a fancy way of speaking.
Yeah, Shakespeare.
Right. But they argued that metaphor is actually the fundamental mechanism of human reasoning itself. Their core premise relies on embodied cognition.
And the idea here is that human brains are basically operating systems built to survive the physical world, right?
Exactly. The brain evolved primarily to manage a physical body in a physical environment, navigating spatial geometry, regulating temperature, avoiding pathogens, processing sensory input. The brain is essentially a sensor-motor processing engine.
So when humans began to develop complex, abstract concepts like justice, time, emotional intimacy, or logical argumentation, we had a problem.
Right. The brain didn't evolve entirely new specialized hardware to process them.
Instead, it basically hacked the system. It co-opted the existing sensory motor pathways. We understand the abstract by systematically mapping it onto the physical via linguistic metaphor.
And we can trace this mapping everywhere in our daily speech. We spatialize time, as we discussed with the Cook Theor, but we do it vertically as well as horizontally.
Right, we say the stock market is rising or falling.
We map morality onto physical cleanliness. A good deed is pure or clean. A corrupt politician is dirty.
We map intellectual arguments onto physical warfare, which I find fascinating.
Oh, that's a huge one. We don't just disagree. We attack someone's position, we defend our claims, we shoot down objections, we look for a weak point in their armor.
The vocabulary of combat literally dictates the conceptual structure of the debate.
Exactly. Think about it. If we had mapped arguments onto a collaborative metaphor like building a house or dancing a waltz, the actual cognitive process of disagreeing with someone would feel fundamentally different.
We also map social relationships and emotions onto physical temperature. We describe a friendly person as warm, an unfriendly reception as chilly, or a tense negotiation as heated.
And this isn't just wordplay. Experimental psychologists have tested whether activating the physical sensor-motor pathway can actually prime the abstract cognitive judgment.
These are the embodied priming experiments, right? Most notably conducted by researchers like Lawrence Williams and John Barr.
Yes. In their classic temperature study, a researcher would casually ask a subject to hold either a hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of iced coffee for just a few moments while riding an elevator up to the lab.
Super casual, like, hey, can you hold this while I grab my keys?
Exactly. Once in the lab, the subject read a neutral description of a hypothetical person and was asked to rate their personality traits.
And the results.
The subjects who had briefly held the warm coffee reliably rated the target person as having a significantly warmer, more generous, and more trustworthy personality compared to the subjects who held the iced coffee.
That is crazy. So the physical sensation of heat in the hands activated the neural pathway associated with temperature.
Which, because of our linguistic metaphors, cascaded into the neural networks governing social trust.
Wow. And we see similar effects with the spatial metaphors, too. Engaging subjects in physical movements, like leaning forward in a chair versus leaning backward, measurably alters their cognitive processing speed when making decisions about future-oriented versus past-oriented scenarios.
The physical posture interacts bidirectionally with the temporal judgment.
The most visceral example of this, I think, is the Lady Macbeth effect, testing the metaphor of moral purity and physical cleanliness.
Oh, that's a brilliant study. Researchers Zong and Ligenquist asked subjects to recall a past ethical transgression, a lie or a betrayal they felt guilty about.
So they primed them with guilt.
Right. Afterward, half the subjects were offered a physical cleansing wipe to clean their hands, while the control group received nothing.
And what happened?
The subjects who physically wiped their hands reported significantly lower levels of lingering moral guilt and were subsequently less likely to volunteer for a compensatory helping task.
The physical act of sanitizing the skin neurologically satisfied the abstract psychological need for moral absolution.
Yes, because the brain processes moral disgust and physical disgust using heavily overlapping circuitry in the anterior insula, and they are bound together by the metaphor of dirty behavior.
Now, in the spirit of absolute scientific rigor, we have to address the replication crisis in psychology here.
Yes, we absolutely do.
Because many of these specific behavioral priming studies, particularly the warm coffee experiment and elements of the Lady Macbeth effect, have faced severe scrutiny in recent years.
They have. Subsequent labs have frequently failed to replicate the dramatic behavioral shifts, suggesting that while priming effects exist, they are highly fragile, extremely context-dependent, and heavily influenced by subtle environmental variables.
So it's not like a magic button you can just press.
No, the dramatic behavioral outputs of these specific experiments might have been overstated in the initial literature. However, and this is a vital nuance, neuroimaging studies consistently validate Lakoff and Johnson's underlying theory.
But fMRI data holds up.
It really does. fMRI scans show that processing metaphorical language like saying someone had a rough day physically activates the somatosensory cortex, the exact area of the brain responsible for processing physical texture.
So the behavioral priming might be fragile in a lab setting, but the neural mapping of abstract concepts onto physical pathways via language is a proven foundational architecture of the mind.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the ultimate practical application for you, the listener. If our native language constructs this intricate scaffolding of gendered networks, spatial frames, and physical metaphors, what is physically happening in your brain when you undertake the grueling process of learning a second language?
It's a great question. You are not simply memorizing a secondary lexicon. You are building parallel cognitive architecture.
You are acquiring an entirely new cognitive toolkit.
Exactly. When a bilingual person acquires a new language, they're acquiring a new set of associative networks, new metaphorical mappings, and new categorical boundaries for color and space.
But the common fear among language learners is that acquiring this new architecture requires demolishing the old one.
The fear of losing yourself.
Right. Does this mean I lose my original perspective? Like if I spend a decade becoming fluent in German and my brain starts routinely associating bridges with femininity and apples with masculinity, do I slowly lose my English objectivity? Does the new OS overwrite the original?
The neurological evidence shows quite the opposite, actually. You don't overwrite, you expand. Bilingual brains exhibit profound cognitive flexibility through a mechanism called joint activation.
Joint activation.
Yes. When a bilingual person is speaking or listening, the neural networks for both languages are simultaneously active and competing.
Both are running at the same time.
Yes. The brain must constantly exercise inhibitory control, suppressing the English network while the German network is operating, and vice versa.
And that constant exercise of executive function makes the bilingual brain incredibly plastic.
Incredibly. The two conceptual systems overlap and interact. And importantly, the cognitive effects of language are context-dependent.
So depending on which language I'm using, I'm thinking slightly differently.
Exactly. When a bilingual speaker is immersed in a German linguistic context, the semantic networks associated with German grammar and metaphor are highly activated, subtly pulling their cognitive biases in that direction.
And when they switch back to English?
When they switch to an English context, those specific biases recede, and the English conceptual framework becomes dominant again. They essentially possess the ability to shift their cognitive lens based entirely on the linguistic environment.
Wow. So the ultimate takeaway of all this research isn't the bleak, deterministic trap Worf initially imagined.
No, we are not prisoners of our mother tongue.
Instead, the science reveals a dynamic, expansive reality of linguistic relativity. Every single language you acquire expands the parameter space of your consciousness.
It hands you a new set of tools for categorizing the visual spectrum, mapping time onto the physical world, and building abstract concepts from physical sensations.
It is such an empowering conclusion. It validates the immense cultural and cognitive value of linguistic diversity globally. Our minds are not fixed entities. They are highly adaptable systems shaped continuously by the structural features of the languages we inhabit.
It's a beautiful system.
It is, which leaves us with a final, slightly unsettling thought to mull over as we wrap up. We've established that the specific structures, grammatical quirks, and distinct metaphors of thousands of human languages profoundly shape cognitive diversity across the globe, right?
Yes.
But what happens as our communication becomes heavily mediated by technology? As we increasingly rely on AI models to draft our emails, standardizing our grammar into highly predictable, efficient algorithms.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Right. As internet slang and emojis flatten nuanced cultural expressions into globally homogenized formats. If language is the software that shapes our thoughts, and we are slowly outsourcing the writing of that software to a standardized, centralized artificial intelligence, are we inadvertently engineering a massive reduction in the cognitive diversity of the human race?
That was a chilling thought.
If we allow a machine to smooth out all the linguistic friction, will we eventually lose the capacity to think the jagged, complex thoughts those old languages used to afford us?
A profound question to end on.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you speak, take a moment to notice the words you choose and consider how those words are silently architecting the reality you experience. We'll see you next time.